When I first moved into Willow Creek Estates, it felt like I had stepped into a dream. The houses were picture-perfect, with neatly trimmed lawns and flower beds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. Every morning, the sun would rise over rows of charming homes, and the streets were so quiet you could hear birds chirping, as if nature itself approved of this little slice of paradise. It wasn't just a neighborhood. It was the asterisk neighborhood everyone talked about. Kids rode their bikes down cul-de-sacs, neighbors waved hello like old friends, and everything seemed to shine with an almost magical glow. But beneath all that perfection, there was something else, a shadow I didn't notice at first. It came in the form of the Homeowners Association, or HOA for short. At first glance, it sounded harmless enough. A group of neighbors working together to keep the community looking nice. They sent out newsletters filled with tips on gardening and reminders about annual block parties. To me, it seemed sweet, quaint even. But then, things started to feel off. It began subtly. A few days after moving in, I noticed how particular people were about rules. One neighbor told me my welcome mat was too big and suggested I get one that matched the approved dimensions. Another politely mentioned that my curtains might be too bright and recommended switching to something more neutral. At the time, I brushed it off as quirky behavior, thinking maybe these folks just cared a lot about appearances. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Then came Karen. She wasn't officially part of the HOA board, but she acted like she ran the place. You've probably met someone like her before, the kind of person who always knows best and isn't afraid to tell you when you're wrong. Karen patrolled the streets like a watchdog, clipboard in hand, ready to pounce on anyone who dared break the rules. Whether it was a car parked in the wrong spot or a garden gnome placed too close to the sidewalk, nothing escaped her attention. One sunny afternoon, while I was watering my plants, Karen appeared out of nowhere. She marched up my driveway with two men trailing behind her. Both wore matching polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched onto the chest, and both carried strange devices on their belts. My stomach dropped when I realized what those devices were: tasers. "Good afternoon," Karen said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We're here to inspect your property." "Inspect?" I blinked, confused. "What do you mean, inspect?" She held up her clipboard like it was some kind of official decree. "According to Article 9, Section B of the HOA Guidelines, we have the right to conduct inspections whenever necessary to ensure compliance with community standards." Compliance? With what? My house was clean. My yard was tidy, and I hadn't done anything remotely unusual since moving in. Still, Karen didn't wait for permission. She motioned for her companions to follow her as they pushed past me and began poking around my yard. They snapped pictures of my grill, criticized the placement of my patio furniture, and even questioned whether my mailbox leaned slightly to the left. Each accusation felt like a punch to the gut, leaving me stunned and speechless. By the time they left, I was shaking, not just from anger, but from fear. Who were these people, and why did they act like they owned my home? What had I gotten myself into? It was the third night after receiving the ultimatum, and I thought I'd finally gotten a moment to breathe. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that wraps around you like a blanket after days of chaos. I had spent hours organizing my evidence, photos, receipts, notes, and drafting emails to local authorities and media outlets. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things would turn out okay. But then it happened. A loud pounding on my front door jolted me awake. My heart raced as I scrambled out of bed, my mind spinning with questions. Who could be knocking at this hour? Was it Karen again? Or worse, someone else from the HOA? I crept toward the door, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and peeked through the peephole. What I saw made my blood run cold. Karen stood there, clipboard in hand, flanked by two burly men wearing matching polo shirts with the HOA logo. Behind them were two police officers, their uniforms stark under the flickering porch light. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't a casual visit. It was something far more serious. "We need you to open the door," one of the officers called out, his voice firm but not unkind. "There's been a report of unsafe conditions inside." Unsafe conditions. In my home. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Before I could respond, Karen pushed forward, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. "For your own safety," she announced dramatically, "we're seizing control of the premises until further notice." Seizing control. I stared at her, my mouth hanging open in disbelief. How could they possibly justify this? This was my house, my sanctuary. Paid for, lived in, loved. And now these people were acting like they owned it. One of the officers stepped closer, holding up a document. "Ma'am, we've been instructed to secure the property pending resolution of outstanding violations. You have 1 hour to gather your belongings." I wanted to scream, to argue, to demand answers. But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I stood frozen, watching as Karen and her goons barged past me without waiting for permission. They moved through my home like they belonged there, tossing my things into boxes with ruthless efficiency. Books, clothes, photo frames, all piled together without care or respect. The officers lingered near the doorway, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. One of them avoided eye contact altogether, while the other muttered something about following protocol. It was clear they didn't want to be here any more than I wanted them to be. As I watched helplessly, tears welled up in my eyes. This wasn't just an invasion of my space. It was an attack on my dignity. Every item they touched carried memories, pieces of who I was. Yet here they were, treating my life like it was nothing more than clutter to be sorted and discarded. Karen handed me another stack of papers, her lips curling into a smug smile. "You've been evicted pending resolution of outstanding violations," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "You'll receive further instructions once the board reviews your case." Evicted. The word echoed in my head, hollow and heavy. I wanted to fight back, to tell her exactly what I thought of her and her so-called board. But exhaustion weighed me down, and fear kept me silent. All I could do was stand there, clutching the papers in trembling hands, as they turned my world upside down. When they finally left, the house felt eerily empty. Boxes lined the hallway, reminders of everything I'd lost in just a few short hours. I sank onto the floor, overwhelmed by a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How had it come to this? How had a place that once felt like paradise become a battleground? But even in my lowest moment, a spark of defiance remained. I refused to let them win. If Karen and her crew thought they could intimidate me into submission, they were wrong. Dead wrong. I didn't know how yet, but I vowed to take back what was mine, even if it meant fighting tooth and nail every step of the way. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my door while I was still sipping my first cup of coffee. At first glance, it looked official, stamped with the HOA logo and written in language that sounded like it belonged in a courtroom. But as I read through the lines, my stomach sank. This wasn't just a warning or a polite reminder. It was an ultimatum. According to the HOA, I had violated several rules during their so-called inspection. The list was absurd. Overgrown grass. It wasn't. Improper placement of outdoor furniture. Ridiculous. And unauthorized modifications to the garage door. Non-existent. Each violation came with a fine. And if I didn't fix everything within 72 hours, they threatened to take further action. And by further action, they meant eviction. Eviction. From my own home. How was that even possible? I stared at the paper, my hands trembling. This wasn't about keeping the neighborhood tidy anymore. It felt personal, like they were deliberately targeting me because I dared to question them. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself this had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe Karen had exaggerated things. Maybe the board would listen if I explained. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't about fairness. It was about control. That afternoon, I called a lawyer. He was a family friend, someone I trusted to give honest advice. When I told him what was happening, he listened quietly, his expression growing more serious with every word. Finally, he sighed and said, "This is bad, but it's not uncommon." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. He explained that HOAs often operated in gray areas, using vague language and covenants to justify heavy-handed tactics. Technically, they couldn't evict me. That wasn't legal, but they could impose fines, drag me into court, and make my life miserable until I either complied or gave up. Many judges sided with HOAs because homeowners usually signed agreements when purchasing their properties, unknowingly giving away certain rights. "So what should I do?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Document everything," he said firmly. "Take photos, save emails, record conversations if you can. Build your case, and whatever happens, don't let them see you break. They thrive on intimidation." His words stuck with me long after we hung up. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers Karen had given me. I felt trapped, like I was standing on quicksand and sinking deeper with every passing second. For the first time since moving to Willow Creek, I questioned whether I'd made a huge mistake. The next day, I decided to fight back, not recklessly, but strategically. I started gathering evidence. I took pictures of my yard, showing how perfectly trimmed the grass was. I measured the distance between my patio furniture and the house, proving it met the guidelines. I even dug out old receipts for the garage door, confirming it was installed by a licensed contractor years ago. Every detail mattered, no matter how small. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Whenever I stepped outside, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked across the street. Late at night, I heard footsteps near my windows. Once, I found a note taped to my front door: "Comply or leave." No signature, no explanation, just those chilling words. It was psychological warfare, plain and simple. They wanted me to crack, to pack my bags and walk away without a fight. But I refused to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I channeled my fear into determination. I reached out to other neighbors, asking if they'd experienced similar treatment. To my surprise, many had, but none had spoken up, afraid of retaliation. Together, we formed a group chat, sharing stories and pooling resources. Some offered legal advice, others promised to testify if it came to that. Slowly but surely, I began to feel less alone. What started as a personal battle was turning into something bigger, a movement to expose the truth about the HOA and reclaim our community. Still, the pressure mounted. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every phone call sent shivers down my spine. I knew Karen and her crew weren't done with me yet. If anything, they were gearing up for round 2. But this time, I was ready. Whatever they threw at me next, I vowed to stand my ground. The inspection was nothing like I expected. Karen didn't just stroll through my yard with a casual glance. She and her 2 goons turned it into a full-blown invasion. They moved methodically, snapping pictures of everything: my mailbox, my grill, even the potted plants on my patio. Every few minutes, one of them would jot something down on their clipboard, their faces stern and judgmental, as if they were detectives uncovering evidence at a crime scene. "This violates Article 4, Section D," one of the men said, pointing at my welcome mat. "It's too large and doesn't match the approved dimensions." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "It's a welcome mat. How does that affect anyone?" He shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Rules are rules." Karen chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We're just trying to maintain consistency, dear. You understand, don't you?" No, I didn't understand. Not at all. But before I could respond, they were already moving on to the next violation. The grill in my backyard drew particular scrutiny. One of the men circled it slowly, inspecting it from every angle like it was some kind of illegal contraption. "This is a fire hazard," he declared confidently. It's placed too close to the house. That's ridiculous. I shot back, my frustration bubbling over. It's been there for months, and no one has ever said anything about it before. Karen tilted her head, feigning concern. Well, someone's saying something now. Her words hit me like a slap. She wasn't here to help or guide. She was here to intimidate. And it was working. My hands trembled as I crossed my arms, trying to steady myself. This wasn't an inspection. It was a power trip. They weren't looking for problems. They were creating them. When they reached my flower beds, things got worse. These bushes are overgrown, one of them announced, gesturing vaguely at my perfectly trimmed hedges. Overgrown. I'd spent hours pruning those bushes just days ago. They looked immaculate, or at least they had until these people showed up. And this, Karen said, holding up a small garden gnome I kept near the edge of the yard. This is against community guidelines. Decorative items must be neutral and unobtrusive. The gnome, a gift from my niece, wasn't neutral or obtrusive. It was cheerful, whimsical, and harmless, but arguing felt pointless. No matter what I said, they twisted it into another violation, another reason to criticize. By the time they finished their tour, they had compiled a list of nearly a dozen infractions, each more absurd than the last. As they packed up their clipboards and cameras, Karen handed me a sheet of paper. "You'll need to address these issues within 72 hours, she said, her tone clipped. Failure to comply will result in further action. Further action. What did that even mean? Eviction. Fines. A lifetime ban from planting flowers. I wanted to ask, but the look in her eyes stopped me. She wasn't here to answer questions. She was here to deliver orders. After they left, I collapsed onto my porch steps, my mind racing. How had this spiraled so quickly? One moment, I was watering my plants, enjoying a peaceful afternoon. The next, I was being treated like a criminal in my own home. I glanced around my yard, once a source of pride and joy. Now it felt tainted, marked by invisible lines I couldn't see but was somehow expected to follow. The mailbox suddenly seemed crooked, the grill dangerously close to the house, and the gnome. Well, maybe it was a little quirky, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the sinking realization that this wasn't about rules or standards. It was about control. And Karen wasn't going to let me forget it anytime soon. The turning point came during a televised town hall meeting. It was the kind of event that usually drew a small crowd, mostly retirees and local officials. But this time, the room was packed. Word had spread quickly after the article went viral, and people from all over the county showed up to hear what I had to say. Reporters lined the walls, microphones in hand, ready to capture every word. The air buzzed with anticipation, and as I stepped up to the podium, my heart pounded so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. I took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the lectern to steady myself. Behind me was a screen displaying photos and documents. Evidence of Karen's intimidation tactics, forged inspection reports, and even screenshots of text messages where she admitted to exaggerating violations. I looked out at the sea of faces, neighbors, strangers, reporters, and began to speak. For months, I said, my voice trembling but clear, I've lived in fear. Fear of being fined for things I didn't do. Fear of losing my home because someone decided I wasn't following their rules. Fear of speaking out, knowing they might retaliate. But tonight, I'm not afraid anymore. The room fell silent. I recounted everything. The raid on my house, the tasers, the eviction notice, the way Karen and her crew had treated me like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. I described how they'd turned our neighborhood into a place ruled by fear instead of kindness. And then I turned to Karen, who sat stiffly in the front row, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. These people aren't protecting our community, I said, pointing directly at her. They're terrorizing it. The crowd erupted into applause. Some people stood, clapping and cheering, while others shouted words of encouragement. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months approached the microphone to share their own stories. One man talked about how he'd been fined for planting flowers that weren't on the approved list. A young mother tearfully explained how she'd been forced to remove her kid's sandbox because it obstructed the view. Each story added fuel to the fire, and by the time the last speaker finished, the mood in the room had shifted completely. Karen tried to defend herself, of course. She stood up, her face flushed, and insisted that everything she'd done was for the good of the community. But her words rang hollow. The crowd booed and jeered until she finally sat down, defeated. After the meeting, reporters swarmed me, eager for sound bites and details. My phone buzzed nonstop with calls and messages from neighbors offering support. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't fighting alone. Within days, the story exploded. Local officials launched an investigation into the HOA's practices, freezing their assets and suspending their authority pending further review. Karen resigned in disgrace, though not before issuing a weak apology that no one believed. Her goons disappeared, presumably to avoid scrutiny. The coalition we'd formed grew stronger, with more neighbors stepping forward to share their experiences and demand change. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. The weight that had been crushing me for weeks began to lift, replaced by a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's iron grip. But the fight wasn't entirely over yet. While the immediate threat had passed, I knew there was still work to be done. We needed to rebuild, not just the neighborhood, but trust among its residents. Willow Creek Estates had been poisoned by fear and control for too long. It was time to heal, to create something better than what we'd lost. As I left the town hall that night, surrounded by neighbors who now felt more like friends, I realized something important. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about winning. It's about inspiring others to do the same. And in that moment, I knew we were on the right path. The days that followed were a blur of chaos and heartbreak. I found myself living out of a suitcase in a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, miles away from the home I loved. The room was small, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew that clung to everything. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that weighed on me. It was the sense of displacement, the feeling that I didn't belong anywhere anymore. Every morning, I woke up determined to fight back. But some days, it felt like the world was conspiring against me. I called lawyers, filed complaints, and reached out to local news outlets, hoping someone would listen. At first, no one took me seriously. To them, this was just another squabble between a homeowner and their HOA, a petty disagreement over rules and regulations. But as I shared my story, showing them photos of the raid, the forged documents Karen had used to justify her actions, and the stack of unreasonable violations, I began to see a shift. Neighbors started reaching out too. Many admitted they'd been too afraid to speak up before, terrified of becoming the next target. One woman told me how Karen had fined her for painting her front door a shade of blue that wasn't approved. Another neighbor confessed he'd been forced to remove his children's swing set because it supposedly blocked the view of the street. Their stories mirrored mine, filled with frustration and helplessness. Together, we decided to take a stand. We formed a coalition, meeting secretly in basements and coffee shops to avoid drawing attention. Each person brought something to the table: evidence, contacts, or simply moral support. We pooled our resources, gathering photos, emails, and testimonies to build a case against the HOA. Some neighbors even offered to testify if it came to court. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't alone. But Karen wasn't backing down. If anything, she grew more aggressive. She spread rumors around the neighborhood, accusing me of fabricating the raid and exaggerating the situation. Flyers appeared on mailboxes, warning residents not to trust me. At one point, she even tried to sue me for defamation, claiming I was damaging the reputation of Willow Creek Estates. Her tactics were desperate, but they worked. They planted seeds of doubt in people's minds. Still, I refused to give up. Every setback only fueled my determination. I spent hours drafting letters to city officials, pleading for an investigation into the HOA's practices. I reached out to journalists, sharing every detail of what had happened. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. A local reporter agreed to meet with me, and after hearing my story and seeing the evidence, I could tell she was moved. She promised to write an article exposing the truth about Karen and the HOA. Meanwhile, life in the motel was taking its toll. The walls felt like they were closing in, and the loneliness was suffocating. Nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, replaying the raid in my mind, wondering if I'd ever feel safe again. But then I'd think about the growing coalition, the strength we found in standing together, and I'd remind myself why I couldn't quit. One evening, as I sat at the tiny desk in my motel room, scrolling through messages of support from neighbors, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice, for all of us. Karen and her crew had gone too far, not just with me, but with countless others who had suffered in silence. We deserved better than fear and intimidation. We deserved a community where kindness mattered more than control, where people looked out for each other instead of policing every move. By the end of the week, the article hit the local news website. The headline read, HOA gone rogue. Residents speak out against intimidation tactics. Within hours, the story went viral. Calls poured in from reporters across the state, eager to learn more. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached me in public, thanking me for speaking up. Even strangers reached out, sharing their own horror stories about HOAs and offering words of encouragement. Karen, however, wasn't pleased. She issued a weak apology, trying to paint herself as misunderstood. But it was too late. The damage was done. Public opinion had shifted, and there was no turning back. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we were finally getting somewhere. Months later, I finally returned to my home, a place I had almost given up on ever seeing again. The key felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked the door, and for a moment, I hesitated before stepping inside. Everything looked different, not because anything had changed, but because I had changed. The walls were still the same soft beige. The sunlight still streamed through the windows, just like it always had. But the house no longer felt like mine. Not yet, anyway. The first thing I did was open all the windows. Fresh air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of blooming flowers from my garden. It felt symbolic, like I was clearing out not just the stale air, but also the lingering shadows of everything that had happened. One by one, I unpacked the boxes Karen's crew had hastily filled during the raid. Each item, photos, books, keepsakes, felt like a piece of myself coming back to life. By the time I finished, the house didn't just look like mine. It felt like mine again. Word spread quickly that I was back. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles, baked goods, and offers to help however they could. Some even apologized for staying silent when Karen and her team ran rampant through the neighborhood. "We should have stood up sooner," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "You didn't deserve to go through that alone." Her words touched me deeply, and I realized how much we'd all grown since those dark days. The HOA was gone, for good this time. After the investigation revealed widespread misuse of funds, forged documents, and blatant abuse of power, the city dissolved the organization entirely. In its place, a new council was formed, made up of actual residents who cared about fairness and transparency. They held regular meetings where everyone's voice mattered, not just a select few. Rules still existed, of course, but they were reasonable now, designed to keep the neighborhood safe and beautiful without trampling over people's rights. As spring turned to summer, Willow Creek began to feel like a completely different place. People smiled more, lingered longer during conversations, and actually helped each other out. Kids played freely in the streets, their laughter echoing through the cul-de-sacs. Even the gardens seemed brighter, bursting with color and life. It wasn't perfect. No community ever is, but it was real. And that made all the difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on my front porch with a cup of tea, watching the world go by. A neighbor waved as he walked his dog, and another called out a cheerful greeting from across the street. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. This wasn't just a house or a neighborhood anymore. It was home. Looking back, I realized how much I'd learned from the experience. Standing up to Karen and the HOA hadn't been easy, but it taught me the value of courage, resilience, and community. I'd discovered strength I didn't know I had, and in doing so, I'd inspired others to find theirs too. Together, we'd taken something broken and turned it into something beautiful. Willow Creek would never be the picture-perfect paradise it once pretended to be, and honestly, that was okay. Perfection is overrated. Sometimes, flaws make a place feel real, lived in, human. And for the first time, this street felt exactly that, real. As I leaned back in my chair, sipping my tea and watching fireflies dance in the twilight, I smiled. Life here wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And that was enough.